Kenya's Treasury recently revealed projections indicating that the country will spend 61% of its total projected tax collection on a debt repayment in the 2019-2020 financial year. This made the controller of the budget to raise the red flag on the country's increasing public debt. However, the Treasury has a relaxed stance on this and says that public debt will only become unsustainable if it hits 70% of GDP. We're now joined on the show by Dr. Caesar Mwangi, who is the chairman for the Kenya Markets Trust. Doctor, thanks for making time to speak to us. First of all, often when we do hear this talk about debt distress and whether or not debt is sustainable, we are told if the revenues coming in are not actually way lower than the expenditure, we shouldn't be worrying. Tell me, why are you particularly concerned this time around?
I think the control of budget has got a point, because the control of budget is basically saying we are trying to set up a budget which is going to meet the needs of the country. And if the bulk of that money in our budget is going to pay a foreign debt, then we shall have very little money left in the country to meet our recurrent and development expenditure. And I think that is a very logical position. I'm really surprised that the Treasury is saying that we are not in any unsustainable debt situation until we get to 70% of our GDP in terms of repayments. And I think that is a little bit of a stretch. We are somehow stretching our luck a little bit. As we speak right now, we have huge projects on which expenditures have been frozen because there's not enough money in the country to pay for them. And I think that's where the control of budget is coming from. And I am not sure why the Treasury is insisting that indeed we have no situation in terms of debt sustainability. I think we have a challenge in terms of our debt sustainability at this time.
Right, Dr. Mwangi, let's talk about the proportion of internal debt here to the external debt, because a country like South Africa, of course, one might argue these are two different economies. One is still very developing, the other is, well, an emerging market. But if you are to look at the composition of the debt here, the rand-denominated debt is actually, the composition is arguably the lion's share, and that kind of eludes a lot of the risk. Kenya, on the other hand, we're seeing a lot of external debt. Tell me, is this something that is worrying you away from the sustainability as a whole?
Absolutely. You see, the external debt, for one, we've got to pay it back in foreign currency, which means that somehow we've got to generate the foreign currency to pay for it. As we speak right now, our main generation of foreign currency in this country is coming from remittances from Kenyans who are living abroad. That's one. Two, we're getting foreign income from our exports, mainly in agriculture. That is horticulture, which is the leading export crop, and tea, which is also a leading export crop. And we're also getting some of our exports to our neighboring countries, which is bringing in foreign currency. But there is just no way that this money is sufficient to pay the foreign debt. And the worst part of it is, just in case the Kenya currency loses value, it means our debt repayment proportion is going to go up because we're paying in foreign currency. And that means that we have got a currency risk facing us. So as you say, rightfully so, if the debt was local debt, borrowed from the local market, that would not have the currency risk that we face. But right now, if the debt is very high, and the only way we can repay it is with foreign currency, and we've got limited sources of foreign currency, it means that we are coming to a point where we risk, in case we have a loss in value in our currency, it means we have a huge increase in that amount of debt due to the currency risk that we face. So I think personally, from my view, we should be very, very careful with foreign debt. Just as we've seen countries like Malaysia saying they do not want to take any more debt from China, they are being prudent. I think we need to be a little bit more prudent, which is, I think, what the controller of budget is saying. She is basically saying that we need to be a little bit more prudent in our borrowing. The second thing that we also need to consider, there are certain loans that are being borrowed in foreign currency. But as they are borrowed, unfortunately, we are not seeing the investments being made in the country. And it's just this last couple of days, yesterday and today, that we've seen in our daily newspapers that there are certain loans that have been taken to build certain dams, and yet those dams did not have a design plan and nothing has happened, yet the loan repayments are now coming due again in foreign currency. And these were loans that were borrowed from Italy. Huge loans, I think, in the region of about 20 billion Kenyan shillings have been borrowed, and still we do not see what has been done on the ground with these loans. So we've got to come back to the point of, yes, to borrow is okay, but we've also got to use that money very productively, always recognizing that if we don't use it productively, we still have to pay it. And we may have to pay more than we borrowed because of the currency risk. And I think these are the prudent issues which I don't think are being addressed adequately from my own point of view. And it's going to be a difficult situation for us in Kenya if we do have a huge currency risk falling against us.
Doctor, definitely currency risk is one to watch on the horizon. I want to probe you on two things. One is with this denomination of external debt, to what extent do you, how soon should I rephrase that, do you see the likes of Moody's, Fitch, Standard & Poor knocking on your window in the near term to actually say, guys, guess what, this debt to GDP ratio is worrying? And the second is, are we about to see some rollover risk of some of the debt instruments that were issued a few years ago before?
Yes. In fact, okay, let's look at the rating that we currently have, and whether that is likely to be downgraded. From my own point of view, and just taking a cue from the controller of budget, I think she has a point, and therefore I will not be very surprised if we get downgraded in terms of risk. I will not be surprised by the international grading agencies. I will not be surprised that happens, and this is really even following up from the comments made by the controller of budget. Secondly, the issue of loans, we have been negotiating certain loans right now, which are being negotiated, foreign currency loans, financing, to help us repay some of the debts that we have. So we have a problem whereby some loans are falling due and we don't have enough money, so we're negotiating other loans to pay them off, right? We may be able to negotiate with the lenders and tell them, look, give us more time. But I'm not sure that is working, because I have heard, and I've been reading the daily press, that there are certain situations where we've actually had to negotiate financing to help us repay off some of the existing loans. So this is not a good situation, I must say. And then just from a common sense point of view, when you're in a hole, you don't try and plug that hole by digging another hole. You try and plug that hole by increasing your productivity so that you can then plug the hole that you are in. But you don't try and plug the hole by digging another hole, because then you may be forced to dig another hole to plug in the second hole, and another hole to plug in the third hole, and that's when you have a sustainability issue, which then comes to the fore, and you find that you're labeled as a defaulter, and they're all issues that come against you. So I still insist that, from my view, I believe we should be more prudent. We should be more prudent, and I think the controller of budget is leading that conversation. And from her point of view, she knows what is in the budget, what is it being put in the budget, and what demands there will be from her office for allocations for recurrent expenditure and allocations for development expenditure, and she's very much aware of that. And she's basically saying, if we don't have enough money to allocate to the needs that we have, because all our money is going to our foreign lenders, then we have a problem. I think that is a logical point that she's making. So we have that challenge, I think.
Doctor, this is getting more and more interesting by the second. Two final questions. One is, you did issue a Eurobond. I think it was $2 billion just last year. Are we about to see another Eurobond being issued in the near term? And finally, someone might argue, Doctor, that the U.S. as we speak right now is sitting on more debt than its GDP. This is what, 22 trillion US dollars. And guess what? They're surviving. Right. Tell me, what do you say to such a notion?
Right. In fact, this argument has been used to argue that we don't have too much of our debt levels are sustainable when we compare ourselves to the US and even to Japan, which is I think the third largest economy in the world. The US being number one, China being number two, and Japan being number three. Now, on the issue of a Eurobond being issued, I don't have all the details. I think that's some information that I would need to check with our Treasury. and I don't honestly have that information with me, but I have heard that there's certain, there's a bond that probably is being negotiated, but again, I don't want to be held to that because I'm not proper research on that right now. But the issue of sustainability, comparing ourselves to the United States of America, comparing ourselves to Japan, which are very well developed countries, I would suggest that those are large economies that can probably absorb the shocks of having high debt, okay? Because the economies are very large. We're talking about an economy like Kenya, which is very, very small in terms of actual productive capacity. And if you go by statistics, actually, and I know the argument that is sustainable has been used when we were compared to Japan, which I think is close to 75% of GDP. What you will realize is that the GDP of Japan alone as a country is double the entire African continent, the 55 countries in Africa. You understand that? That statistic is very clear. You can check it out. I've done that research. Now, you cannot compare a country like Kenya to Japan because Kenya, yes, is perhaps bigger than Japan in terms of land size, but it's a very minute economy compared to a country like that. So right. Japan would be able to absorb any shocks because of its debt burden. But a country like Kenya can collapse, just as we saw the collapse in Greece, collapse in Iceland and other countries.